June 5, 1944, 2,247 hours. Over the English Channel, Private First Class John Steele grips the static line with hands that won't stop shaking. The C-47's engines scream loud enough to drown thought. Around him, 17 other paratroopers from Easy Company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, sit in darkness, broken only by the red jump light. The aircraft lurches through flak. A piece of shrapnel punches through the fuselage, missing Steele's head by inches. The temperature inside the plane drops. Wind howls through the hole. Steele touches the cricket clicker in his pocket, the cheap toy that's supposed to identify friend from foe in the dark. 1 click, 2 clicks back. Flash, thunder. The password system that will either save his life or get him killed in the next hour. The jumpmaster yells something lost in engine noise. The light turns green. This is the story of the 13,100 American paratroopers who jumped into Normandy in the first hours of D-Day, June 6, 1944. Their mission: seize key bridges, crossroads, and causeways behind Utah Beach to prevent German reinforcements from crushing the amphibious assault at dawn. What actually happened was chaos. Planes scattered by flak and clouds, men dropped miles from their objectives, equipment lost in swamps, officers dead before they hit the ground. Small groups of lost paratroopers, most of them teenagers who'd never seen combat, ad-libbing the invasion back on track through a combination of training, improvisation, and sheer bloody-minded aggression. They were supposed to land in tight formations. Instead, they were scattered across 25 miles of occupied France. The scattering should have been disaster. Somehow, it became victory. The airborne plan for D-Day was built on calculated risk and doctrinal faith. 2 American divisions would jump in darkness hours before the beach landings. The 82nd Airborne Division, all-American, would seize the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and secure the western flank. The 101st Airborne Division, Screaming Eagles, would capture causeway exits behind Utah Beach and destroy bridges over the Douve River. The Pathfinder teams would jump first at 00:15 hours, mark drop zones with Eureka radar beacons and colored lights. Main force would follow at 01:30 hours. By dawn, American paratroopers would control a corridor 6 miles wide, allowing the 4th Infantry Division to move inland from the beaches. That was the plan. The execution would be something else entirely. The C-47 Skytrain was the workhorse of airborne operations. Cruising speed 160 miles per hour. Service ceiling 24,000 feet, but paratroopers would jump from 500 to 700 feet to minimize exposure to ground fire. Each aircraft carried 18 fully loaded paratroopers. Each man wore 80 to 100 pounds of equipment: main parachute, reserve chute, rifle or carbine, ammunition, grenades, rations, water, entrenching tool, gas mask, first aid kit, and personal items. Some carried additional loads. Machine gunners hauled weapons and ammunition bundles. Demolition men packed explosives. Officers carried maps, radios, and compasses. The weight made movement inside the aircraft nearly impossible. Once you sat down, you stayed down. The 82nd Airborne Division was commanded by Major General Matthew Ridgway, a hard-driving infantry officer who'd taken command in June 1942. Under him, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment was led by Colonel James Gavin, 37 years old. Gavin would jump with his men, a rarity among general officers. He'd land in an apple orchard near La Fière, lose his equipment bundle in the dark, and spend the next 3 days fighting with whatever weapons he could scavenge. The Pathfinders represented the airborne's best. Volunteers selected for navigation skills, physical fitness, and ability to work independently. Each Pathfinder team carried Eureka radar transponders that would guide the main force aircraft, plus colored lamps and radar reflective panels to mark drop zones. First Lieutenant Charles Santasiero led a Pathfinder team for the 505 PIR. His mission: mark drop zone O near Sainte-Mère-Église. He would jump at 00:15 hours, 15 minutes before the main force, with 5 other men and equipment that weighed more than any of them. If the Pathfinders failed, the entire airborne assault would land blind. The weather on June 5th was marginal: low clouds, high winds, rain. General Eisenhower had postponed D-Day from June 5th to June 6th because of the storm. Even on the 6th, conditions were barely acceptable. The C-47s would fly through clouds that obscured visual landmarks. Pilots would navigate by dead reckoning and radio beacons. Some would get lost. Many would. The aircraft formations began taking off from bases across southern England at 22:30 hours on June 5th. 9 serial flights, each containing 36 to 45 aircraft in tight V formations. They flew south over the English Channel, then turned east toward the Cottenham Peninsula. Radio silence, navigation lights off, flying at 500 feet to avoid radar detection. As they crossed the coast, German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The tight formations that had been drilled into pilots for months dissolved in seconds. Pathfinder drop 0015 hours, June 6th, Lieutenant Santasiero's C-47 crossed the coast at 500 feet. Flak burst around them, orange flowers blooming in darkness. The pilot took evasive action, banking hard. The jumpmaster screamed, "Go!" Santasiero and his team went out the door into a maelstrom. Tracer fire drew bright lines through the sky. Explosions lit clouds from within. Santasiero's parachute deployed. He had perhaps 20 seconds in the air. He could see nothing, no landmarks, no other parachutes. He hit the ground hard, rolled, collapsed his chute, and checked his equipment. The Eureka beacon was intact. He activated it, praying the main force pilots would find the signal. Around him, nothing. No other Pathfinders, no colored lights, no one responding to his cricket clicker. He was alone in occupied France with a radio beacon, a carbine, and no idea where he was. Main force drop 0130 to 0230 hours. 821 C-47s carrying 13,100 paratroopers crossed the Cottenham Peninsula. The formations that had been tight over England were scattered chaos over France. Clouds obscured the ground. Flak forced pilots into violent evasive maneuvers. Some aircraft climbed to 2,000 feet to avoid fire. Others dove to 300 feet. Airspeed varied wildly. Some planes slowed to 110 miles per hour. Others accelerated to 200. The jump was supposed to happen at 500 feet and 120 miles per hour for a tight landing pattern. Instead, men jumped from various altitudes and speeds, guaranteeing dispersion. Private First Class John Steele went out the door over Sainte-Mère-Église at 0130 hours. His parachute deployed. Below him, the town square was visible in the light of a burning building. German soldiers fired upward. Steele's parachute caught on the church steeple. He hung there, tangled in his lines, watching Germans shoot other paratroopers as they landed in the square. Steele played dead for 2 hours, suspended from the church, until Germans cut him down and took him prisoner. He would escape 3 days later. His experience, caught on the church while the battle raged below, would become one of the most famous images of D-Day. Most paratroopers had no such clear view of where they were. Private Robert Murphy of the 507 PIR landed in a flooded marsh. The water was neck-deep. His equipment dragged him under. He cut away his parachute and most of his gear, keeping only his rifle and a few grenades. He waded for an hour before finding dry ground. Around him, he could hear men drowning in the darkness, calling for help he couldn't provide. The mist drops were catastrophic in scope. Only 38 of 120 Pathfinders landed on their assigned drop zones. The main force fared worse. Entire sticks of paratroopers landed miles from their objectives. Some landed in the English Channel and drowned. Others came down in flooded areas, drowned in 3 feet of water by the weight of their equipment. Many landed among German positions and were killed before they could organize. The 82nd Airborne was supposed to land in a concentrated area west of Sainte-Mère-Église. Instead, paratroopers were scattered across 25 miles. The 101st Airborne faced similar chaos. Entire battalions ceased to exist as organized units. Companies were reduced to squads. Squads became lone individuals. By 0300 hours, fewer than 1,000 paratroopers out of 13,100 had assembled with their units. The invasion was 3 hours old, but the scattering created unexpected advantages. German commanders received reports of paratroopers landing everywhere. Small groups of Americans seemed to be attacking from all directions simultaneously. The 91st German Infantry Division, responsible for coastal defense, couldn't determine where the main attack was coming. They dispersed their forces to respond to dozens of small contacts instead of concentrating against the actual objectives. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydte, commanding the 6th Parachute Regiment near Carentan, wrote after the war, "The dispersion of American paratroopers created more confusion than any concentrated drop could have achieved. We were receiving reports from every sector. It seemed impossible that so few men could be in so many places. The misdrops turned individual paratroopers into independent raiders operating behind enemy lines with a simple directive: cause chaos." Private First Class Leonard Lebenson landed in a hedgerow 3 miles south of his drop zone. He was alone. His equipment bundle was lost. He had his rifle, 6 magazines, 2 grenades, and a compass. He clicked his cricket. No response. He moved toward the sound of gunfire, reasoning that where there was fighting, there were Americans. He encountered a German patrol on a farm road, 4 soldiers. Lebenson fired first, killed 2, wounded 1. The survivor ran. Lebenson took the wounded German's weapon, a Schmeisser submachine gun, and his ammunition. He continued toward the gunfire. Over the next 6 hours, Lebenson would join and leave 3 different ad hoc groups of paratroopers, fight in 4 separate engagements, and eventually find his company at dawn. His experience was typical. The airborne invasion was not executed by battalions and companies. It was executed by 1s and 2s. Sainte-Mère-Église became the first town in France liberated on D-Day. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, commanding 3rd Battalion, 505 PIR, landed with a small group near the town at 0130 hours. By 0430 hours, he'd gathered about 180 men, less than a third of his battalion. Krauss decided to assault the town immediately rather than wait for more troops. The Germans in Sainte-Mère-Église were already demoralized. They'd watched hundreds of paratroopers descend through flak. They'd fought dozens of small actions through the night. When Krauss's force attacked from multiple directions, the German garrison broke and retreated. By 0500 hours, Krauss's men controlled the town square. Lieutenant Colonel Krauss raised an American flag, the first stars and stripes to fly over liberated France. The flag had been carried in Krauss's pack since the invasion of Sicily. He'd promised himself he'd raise it over the first town his battalion captured in France. The Germans counterattacked at 0800 hours. A force of perhaps 200 infantry with armored support pushed into the southern edge of town. Krauss's paratroopers, now numbering about 300, fought house to house. Private John Fitzgerald, a bazooka gunner who'd lost his weapon in the jump, picked up a German Panzerfaust from a dead soldier and used it to disable a half-track. The German attack stalled. By 1000 hours, they'd withdrawn. Sainte-Mère-Église remained in American hands. The town's liberation was tactically significant, but symbolically crucial. It proved that scattered paratroopers could achieve objectives through aggression and initiative, even when the textbook plan dissolved in contact with reality. Meanwhile, 4 miles west, the most critical battle of the airborne invasion was beginning at La Fière Bridge. La Fière was a stone bridge crossing the Merderet River. The river itself was narrow, but the Germans had flooded the surrounding area, creating a marsh 500 yards wide on either side. The bridge was the only crossing point for miles. Control of La Fière meant control of the western approaches to Utah Beach. Without it, American forces landing on the beach would be bottled up. The 505th PIR was supposed to seize and hold La Fière, but the regiment was scattered. General Ridgway himself landed in an apple orchard a mile from the bridge, lost his equipment, and spent an hour searching for his unit. Captain Ben Schwartzwalder, commanding G Company 507 PIR, landed in the marsh near La Fière with about 15 men. He waded toward the bridge through chest-deep water, taking fire from German positions. By 0600 hours, Schwarzwalder's force had reached the western end of the bridge, where they found about 40 other paratroopers from mixed units already engaged. The senior officer present was Colonel Roy Lindquist, regimental commander of the 508 PIR. Lindquist had perhaps 150 men. The Germans held the eastern end of the bridge with machine guns and mortars. Attempts to rush the bridge were met with devastating fire. The marsh prevented flanking maneuvers. For the next 6 hours, small groups of paratroopers arrived, joined the fight, and tried to force the bridge. Every assault failed. Bodies accumulated on the narrow stone causeway. By noon, the Americans controlled the western approaches but could not advance. The stalemate would last 3 days. German reinforcements, including elements of the 91st Infantry Division, fortified the eastern end. American paratroopers, exhausted and low on ammunition, held the west. The casualty rate was horrific. Captain Schwarzwalder's company lost half its men in the first 24 hours. The 507th PIR, already scattered by the drop, ceased to function as an organized regiment. La Fière became a meat grinder that consumed entire units. But it held. The Germans never retook the western end. American reinforcements from the beach landings eventually arrived and broke the stalemate on June 9th, but the initial seizure and 3-day defense was entirely the work of paratroopers who'd landed in the wrong place, lost their equipment, and fought with whatever they could find. The causeway exits behind Utah Beach were the 101st Airborne's primary objective. 4 causeways, numbered 1 through 4, connected the beach to the interior. The Germans had flooded the area, turning the exits into narrow raised roads through marshland. If the 101st couldn't secure the exits, troops landing on the beach would be trapped. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, commanding 3rd Battalion, 502 PYR, landed 2 miles from his assigned drop zone at 0200 hours. He had 75 men with him, less than a quarter of his battalion. His objective was Causeway Exit 3. Cole moved toward it immediately. By 0400 hours, his force had encountered German positions guarding the causeway. The defenders were elements of the 91st Infantry Division, well dug in with machine guns covering the road. Cole's force attacked without artillery or air support. They used grenades to suppress machine gun positions, then rushed forward with bayonets and rifle fire. The Germans retreated. By 0600 hours, Cole's men held Causeway Exit 3. They'd suffered 15 casualties. Cole organized a defense with his remaining 60 men, expecting a counterattack. It never came. The Germans were too disorganized to respond. At 10:30 hours, the first elements of the 4th Infantry Division, moving inland from Utah Beach, met Cole's paratroopers at the causeway. The link-up was quiet. No celebration. Cole's men were exhausted, hungry, and nearly out of ammunition. But they'd done it. They'd secured the exit. The beach landing could proceed inland. Similar stories played out at the other causeways. Captain Charles Shettle, commanding 2nd Battalion, 502nd PIR, secured Causeway Exit 4 with only 45 men. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy took Exit 2 with a scratch force of 180 from 4 different units. Exit 1 remained contested through D-Day, but troops from the beach found alternate routes. By noon on June 6th, the 101st Airborne had accomplished its primary mission despite losing more than half its men to the missed drops and suffering 25% casualties among those who did make it to the objectives. The success was built on junior officers and NCOS making independent decisions. Between the chaos of battle, paratroopers discovered that occupied France offered certain advantages. The Norman hedgerows, while difficult terrain for maneuvering, provided concealment and cover. Farm buildings contained food that was far better than K rations. French civilians, when contacted carefully, provided information about German positions. Private Carl Cartledge of the 501st PIR spent June 6th hiding in a barn with 3 other paratroopers. The farmer's wife brought them bread, cheese, and cider. She drew a map showing German positions in the area. When a German patrol passed nearby, she warned the Americans in time for them to hide in the hayloft. Cartledge wrote after the war, "That French farm wife saved our lives. We had no idea where we were or where the Germans were. She knew everything. The cricket clicker, that cheap brass toy, became more valuable than any weapon. The challenge was that German soldiers quickly learned the system and used captured crickets to lure Americans into ambushes. Paratroopers adapted by adding verbal challenges. Flash, followed by the response thunder, became standard. But in the darkness and confusion, mistakes happened. Private Dutch Schultz of the 501st PIR shot and killed another American paratrooper who gave the wrong response. He discovered his mistake when he searched the body and found American dog tags. Schultz never spoke about the incident publicly. It was mentioned in his diary, discovered after his death in 1989. Friendly fire was an inevitable consequence of nighttime combat among scattered, exhausted men. No reliable statistics exist for how many paratroopers were killed by other Americans on D-Day, but estimates suggest at least 50 to 100. The psychological cost of these mistakes would haunt survivors for decades. Equipment loss was catastrophic. Nearly every paratrooper lost something critical in the jump or the subsequent fighting. Medics lost medical supplies. Radio men lost radios. Officers lost maps. Machine gunners lost weapons. The ad hoc solution was battlefield salvage and creative substitution. Paratroopers picked up German weapons when American weapons were unavailable. The MP-40 submachine gun, German Schmeisser, became popular because it used 9mm ammunition that was plentiful from captured sources. The Panzerfaust, German single-shot anti-tank weapon, was used by Americans throughout Normandy because it was simpler and more effective than the American bazooka. Private Gordon Carson of the 506th PIR fought the entire day with a German rifle, German grenades, and German ammunition taken from a dead soldier. He didn't fire his American carbine once. The weapon had been lost in the jump. The German response to the airborne invasion was hampered by command structure and misinterpretation. The 91st Infantry Division, responsible for the sector where most paratroopers landed, was a static division of lower-quality troops. Many soldiers were over age or recovering from wounds on the Eastern Front. The division commander, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falley, was killed by American paratroopers on the morning of June 6th while driving to his command post. His death paralyzed the division for critical hours. Higher German command initially interpreted the airborne assault as a diversion. They believed the real invasion would come at Calais. Even after the beach landings began, Hitler refused to release panzer reserves, convinced that Normandy was a feint. This strategic confusion gave the scattered paratroopers crucial time to consolidate and link up with beach forces. By the time German command realized Normandy was the main effort, American forces had established a beachhead that could not be dislodged. Colonel von der Heiter's 6th Parachute Regiment, the best German unit in the area, spent D-Day responding to paratrooper sightings and small unit actions. They never concentrated their full strength against a single objective. Von der Heiter wrote, "We were everywhere engaged and nowhere decisive. The American paratroopers forced us to fight on their terms. We could not ignore them, but we could not defeat them." The climax of the paratrooper battle came not on D-Day, but on June 8th at La Fière Bridge. After 3 days of stalemate, the Americans prepared a final assault. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Timms, commanding the remnants of the 507th PIR, organized an attack force of about 400 men, a mixture of paratroopers and infantry from the 90th Division that had landed on the beach. The assault began at 10:45 hours with artillery preparation. Shells fell on German positions for 15 minutes. Then the infantry advanced across the causeway. German machine guns opened fire immediately. The lead platoons were cut down. Men fell into the marsh on either side of the causeway and drowned, weighted by equipment. The advance stalled. Then someone, identity disputed in after-action reports, started running. A single paratrooper sprinted forward through machine gun fire, firing his weapon from the hip. Others followed. The rush became a wave. Paratroopers reached the German positions and fought hand-to-hand with knives and rifle butts. The Germans broke. By 1400 hours, La Fière was secured. The causeway was open. American casualties exceeded 100. German casualties were higher. The bridge was littered with bodies. Lieutenant Colonel Timms, surveying the scene, said nothing. His official report noted, "Objective secured at cost." The human cost of the D-Day paratrooper drop was severe. Of the 13,100 American paratroopers who jumped into Normandy on June 5th and 6th, approximately 2,500 became casualties in the first 48 hours. 1,240 were killed, missing, or captured. 1,260 were wounded. The casualty rate was nearly 20%, far higher than beach landing forces faced. The 82nd Airborne Division lost 1,259 men in the first 3 days. The 101st Airborne lost 1,240. Some units ceased to exist. The 507th PIR entered Normandy with 2,004 men. By June 10th, only 700 were present for duty. The 508th PIR lost more than half its strength. These were not abstract numbers. They were teenagers from small towns across America who'd volunteered for the most dangerous duty in the war. Private First Class Robert Wright from Tennessee killed in the drop when his parachute failed to open. Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, commanding Easy Company 506 PIR, killed when his C-47 was shot down before he could jump. Hundreds drowned in flooded fields, their names recorded in lists of missing, later confirmed as dead, when bodies were recovered weeks or months later. The physical recovery of wounded paratroopers was complicated by their dispersion. Many wounded men lay in fields or hedgerows for hours or days before medics found them. Some were discovered by French civilians who hid them from Germans and provided basic care. Private Martin Hirsch, a medic with the 501st PIR, spent 3 days treating wounded from multiple units in a barn near Les Forges. He had almost no supplies. He used strips of parachute silk as bandages, Calvados brandy as antiseptic, and morphine he'd salvaged from dead medics. He kept 18 wounded men alive until evacuation was possible. For his actions, Hirsch received no medal. His story only emerged in 1993 when a researcher interviewed him for an oral history project. The psychological impact of the chaotic drop and subsequent fighting marked every survivor. The combination of isolation, darkness, confusion, and sudden violence created trauma that many veterans never processed. Nightmares about parachuting into darkness, about being alone in enemy territory, about the cricket clicker that might signal friend or foe, haunted men for decades. Some paratroopers refused to discuss their experiences, others couldn't stop talking about them. The bond between D-Day paratroopers was unique even among combat veterans. They'd been scattered, lost, afraid, and alone. Then they'd found each other, fought together, and survived. That shared experience created relationships that lasted lifetimes. The annual reunions of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were marked by fierce loyalty and emotional intensity, rare in veteran organizations. The doctrine that emerged from the D-Day paratrooper experience was contradictory. On one hand, the chaos proved that large-scale nighttime airborne assaults were nearly impossible to execute as planned. The missed drops, equipment loss, and command confusion argued against repeating the operation. On the other hand, the paratroopers had accomplished their mission despite the chaos. The causeway exits were secured, Sainte-Mère-Église was liberated, La Fière bridge was held, the German response was disrupted, the invasion succeeded. The lesson the US Army took from Normandy was not to avoid airborne operations, but to improve them. Better navigation equipment was developed. Pathfinder techniques were refined. Communication systems improved. The next major airborne operation, Market Garden in September 1944, would be conducted in daylight with better coordination. It would also fail, but for different reasons. The Normandy experience remained the template. Individual paratroopers from D-Day continued their service through the war. General James Gavin commanded the 82nd Airborne through Holland, Belgium, and Germany. He retired as a lieutenant general. Colonel Robert Cole, who'd secured Causeway Exit 3, was killed in action in Holland on September 18, 1944. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Private John Steele, who hung from the church steeple at Sainte-Mère-Église, survived the war. He returned to the town in 1964 for the 20th anniversary of D-Day. A dummy paratrooper still hangs from the church steeple today, commemorating his experience. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, who raised the first American flag over liberated France, served through the war and retired as a brigadier general. The flag he raised is now in the 82nd Airborne Division Museum at Fort Bragg. Private Carl Cartledge, helped by the French farm wife, survived. He returned to France in 1984 and found the farm. The woman who'd saved him was dead, but her daughter remembered the incident. Cartledge established a scholarship fund for French students studying at American universities in honor of the family. The physical evidence of the paratrooper drop remains visible in Normandy. The church at Sainte-Mère-Église, with its commemorative parachutist. The La Fière bridge, still standing, with a monument listing units that fought there. Crash sites where C-47s went down are marked with plaques. The flooded areas behind Utah Beach were drained after the war, but aerial photographs and soil analysis still reveal where men drowned in 1944. The Airborne Museum at Sainte-Mère-Église houses artifacts, parachutes, weapons, uniforms, personal items, and a restored C-47. Veterans donated most items. Some came with stories: a cricket clicker with bloodstains, a compass that guided a lost lieutenant to his objective, a photograph of a girlfriend carried through the jump and found on a dead paratrooper by a French civilian who preserved it for 50 years before returning it to the soldier's family. Historians continue to debate whether the paratrooper drop was a success or near disaster saved by individual courage. The official U.S. Army history, written by Gordon Harrison and published in 1951, concluded that the operation achieved its objectives at acceptable cost. The scattering, while unplanned, contributed to German confusion. Revisionist historians in the 1990s argued that the operation succeeded despite terrible planning and that casualties were unacceptably high. The 20% casualty rate in 48 hours exceeded any beach landing. The truth is probably both. The plan was flawed, the execution was chaotic, the casualties were severe, and the mission succeeded because individual paratroopers, most of them privates and corporals in their late teens or early 20s, demonstrated initiative, aggression, and improvisation that no training could fully instill. They were dropped into darkness, alone, and told to take objectives miles away. Many died trying. Enough succeeded to change the course of the war. The legacy of D-Day paratroopers is not tactical or technological, it's cultural. They became the embodiment of American fighting spirit. Aggressive, flexible, independent, willing to take casualties to accomplish the mission. Every special operations unit since traces its lineage, at least symbolically, to those scattered paratroopers clicking their crickets in Norman hedgerows. The culture of decentralized initiative, of junior leaders making critical decisions without higher approval, became doctrine throughout the U.S. military. The expectation that soldiers will accomplish missions even when plans collapse and support disappears, that's the D-Day paratrooper legacy. The final reunion of D-Day paratroopers was held in Normandy in 2019 for the 75th anniversary. Fewer than 20 veterans attended. They were in their 90s, most in wheelchairs. They gathered at the church in Sainte-Mère-Église, where Private Steele had hung from the steeple 75 years earlier. A French military band played. Speeches were given. The veterans sat silently for most of it. Then someone produced a cricket clicker, an old one from 1944. The veteran clicked it once. Click. Another veteran across the square clicked back. Click, click. They smiled. For a moment the decades vanished. They were young again, lost in the darkness, finding each other by sound alone. The click meant, "I'm here. You're not alone. We'll figure this out." That sound, that simple brass cricket bought in bulk for pennies, summarized everything about the D-Day paratrooper experience. Isolated but connected, lost but determined, afraid but moving forward. The click and response. Flash, thunder, the passwords that turned strangers into brothers in the dark. The men who jumped into Normandy in the first hours of D-Day were not heroes when they boarded the C-47s. They were terrified kids doing a job that seemed impossible. They became heroes in the hours after landing, when the plan dissolved and they had to create a new one using nothing but training, courage, and each other. They clicked their crickets in the darkness. They heard the response. They moved toward it. They fought. Some died. The rest kept fighting. They secured the exits. They held the bridges. They took the towns. Not because the plan worked, because when the plan failed, they refused to fail with it. That stubbornness, that refusal to accept defeat, even when everything suggested defeat was inevitable, that's why the paratroopers succeeded. That's why the invasion succeeded. That's what we remember when we hear the story of D-Day. Not the grand strategy, not the thousands of ships and aircraft, the single click in darkness, the response that meant someone else was out there, lost like you, scared like you, determined like you. Together, you'd figure out where to go and what to do. The D-Day paratroopers didn't follow the plan, they became the plan. Scattered across 25 miles of enemy territory, they transformed chaos into victory through hundreds of small decisions made by men whose names we'll never all know. They jumped into darkness. They landed alone. They fought together. They won.